Hello everyone. Today I've got a brand new series of spine-chilling horror stories for you. I'm really curious to know which corner of the world you're listening from. Let me know in the comments below. Now, let's get started. That night is something I'll never forget. It had been 2 weeks since I moved in. I had chosen this small apartment in the suburbs to escape the noise of the city. The building was old, and while the apartment wasn't big, it was conveniently located close to my workplace, and the neighborhood was relatively quiet. For someone living alone, it seemed like the perfect choice. When I first moved in, the landlord told me that most of the residents were elderly and rarely left their homes. The hallways were always quiet. After settling in, I finished another busy day and was ready for bed. Outside, the wind had picked up, making the curtains sway slightly. The lights were already off, and the only illumination came from the dim street lamp filtering through the curtains. I pulled the blanket higher and prepared to drift off to sleep. Just as I was about to fall asleep, a faint sound came from the door. It was as if someone was lightly tapping on it. Instantly, my body tensed and my heart began to race. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source. The sound was intermittent, almost like someone outside was testing the waters, unsure if they should knock harder or remain discreet. At first, I thought I must have misheard it. Maybe it was just the wind blowing against the door. The windows in the hallway weren't sealed well, and the wind could easily stir up a lot of noise. But soon, the sound became clearer. Something was lightly knocking on my door. A chill ran down my spine. Without thinking, I threw off the blanket and crept toward the door. The knocks weren't loud, but they were distinct, each one carrying a sense of foreboding. I approached the door carefully, trying not to make any noise, and peered through the peephole. There was nothing but darkness outside. The hallway's single light bulb had been broken for days, and no one had come to fix it. The faint light barely reached beyond the doorstep. I held my breath and watched for a few seconds. There were no figures, no movement, just silence. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Feeling somewhat relieved, I turned back toward my bedroom, thinking the noises had probably stopped. But just as I was about to lie down again, the knocking resumed. This time it wasn't faint or hesitant. It was sharp and fast, like fingers drumming impatiently on the wood. I froze in place, unable to move. The knocks grew more urgent, as if demanding a response, begging me to open the door. I couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of fear that now gripped me. Driven by that fear, I slowly made my way back to the door. This time, instead of looking through the peephole, I grabbed my phone and pulled up the live feed from the smart doorbell camera. My heart pounded harder as my shaky fingers opened the app. The few seconds it took for the video to load felt like an eternity. And when the screen finally came to life, my heart nearly stopped. Standing outside the door was a man. He was wearing a worn, dark coat, his head bent low toward the door, as if listening for something. His hair was unkempt, and in his hand he held something that faintly glinted in the dim light. My pulse quickened, and a cold sweat broke out on my skin. This wasn't my imagination. There was someone standing outside my door. Just as I was about to dial the police, the man suddenly lifted his head, staring directly into the camera. In that moment, I felt my breath catch in my throat. His face was hard to make out in the darkness, but his eyes gleamed with a strange light, and his lips curled into a sinister smile. He knew I was watching him. I quickly exited the camera app, my hands trembling as I fumbled to call the police. I spoke in a whisper, trying to keep my voice steady, terrified the man would hear me. The dispatcher assured me that the nearest patrol car would arrive in 5 minutes. 5 minutes. But those 5 minutes felt like an eternity. I checked the door again, making sure it was securely locked. I stood silently, pressing my ear against the door, trying to hear any movement outside. Then, just as I thought the worst might have passed, I heard the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against the door lock. A wave of dread washed over me. He was trying to break in. The lock made soft clicking noises, as if he was working the mechanism, and it sounded like the lock could give way at any moment. Panic seized me. My mind went blank as the fear overwhelmed me. I quickly backed away into the bedroom, grabbing anything nearby that could serve as a weapon. My eyes stayed glued to the door, bracing myself for what might come next. Suddenly, the distant sound of police sirens echoed through the hallway. The man must have heard it too, because the scraping noise stopped abruptly. I heard hurried footsteps outside the door. He was running. I pulled up the camera feed again, just in time to see the man darting toward the stairwell, disappearing into the shadows. Minutes later, the police arrived. They inspected the lock and confirmed what I already knew. There were clear signs of tampering. The man had tried to force his way in, but by the time the officers searched the area, he was long gone. That night, although the immediate danger had passed, the sense of unease lingered. Even now, I can't shake the feeling of being watched, of the threat still lurking somewhere. Every night, as darkness falls, I find myself recalling that man standing at my door, wondering if he's waiting for another chance to come back. This thought keeps me awake night after night, and even now I can't escape the lingering fear of that unseen menace. I moved to London nearly a year ago. As a graphic designer working for an advertising agency in the city center, I decided to rent an apartment a bit further out, in a quiet residential area in southeast London. The apartment building was old, built in the 1970s, but the rent was affordable and the location was convenient. It wasn't the biggest place, but for someone living alone, it seemed like the perfect fit. At first, everything seemed normal. The neighbors were mostly quiet professionals, and the area was peaceful, if a little sleepy. The building was populated mostly by older residents who kept to themselves, and the streets were lined with small shops and cafes within walking distance. I settled into my routine, growing accustomed to the solitude of living alone in a quiet part of the city. But then strange things started to happen. It began with small, almost insignificant details. One evening, after returning from work, exhausted, I headed to the kitchen to grab something to eat. When I reached for the fruit bowl on the counter, I noticed something odd. Several pieces of fruit were missing, and one apple had a bite taken out of it. I froze, trying to remember if I had eaten them and forgotten, but the bite mark was fresh, and I was certain the fruit had been untouched that morning when I left. At the time, I brushed it off, thinking maybe I was too tired to remember properly. With work being stressful, I figured my mind was just playing tricks on me. But over the next few days, more things started to seem out of place. Books on my coffee table appeared to have been moved, keys I left on the counter would somehow end up in random places, and even my clothes seemed disturbed in the wardrobe. I started feeling uneasy, but the doors were always locked and there were no signs of a break-in. Then, one morning, something happened that made me truly question what was going on. I woke up to get ready for work, only to find the kitchen light on. I clearly remembered turning it off the night before, and yet there it was, bright and glaring. Worse, there were drops of water in the sink, as if someone had recently used it. A horrifying thought crept into my mind. Had someone been in my apartment while I was asleep? To put my mind at ease, I decided to install a hidden camera in the corner of the living room, facing the kitchen. It was a simple setup, but I figured it would help me find some answers, or at the very least, prove that I was just being paranoid. For the next few days, nothing unusual happened, and I started to feel a bit more relaxed. But that sense of relief didn't last long. The calm before the storm was about to end. One night, I woke up to a faint sound. It was quiet but unmistakable, footsteps. They were coming from the living room, slow and deliberate, as if someone was carefully moving around, trying not to wake me. My heart started pounding. I could feel the blood rushing in my ears as I lay still, too terrified to move. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, the dim light of the screen barely illuminating the room. Slowly, I got out of bed, trying to make as little noise as possible. My mind raced, imagining who or what could be in the other room. I tiptoed to the bedroom door and peeked out into the dark living room, but I couldn't see anything. I took a deep breath, flipped on the light switch, and braced myself. The room was empty. I stood there for a moment, frozen in place, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. The apartment was silent again, and nothing seemed disturbed. The front door was still locked, and all the windows were secure. I started to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing, but something inside me told me that wasn't the case. Desperate for answers, I opened the camera app on my phone to check the footage from earlier that night. What I saw on the screen made my blood run cold. The video showed a stranger emerging from the storage room beside my bedroom. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark, faded jacket, and he moved with eerie precision, as if he knew the apartment well. He didn't turn on any lights, but made his way directly to the kitchen. I watched in horror as he calmly turned on the tap, took a drink, and then turned toward the hallway leading to my bedroom. My hands trembled as I watched him walk to my bedroom door and stand there, staring at it. He didn't make a sound, just stood silently, as if waiting to see if I would wake up. After a few minutes, he slowly turned around and walked back into the storage room, disappearing into the shadows as if he had never been there. I slammed the phone down, my heart racing. There was no denying what I had seen. Someone had been living in my apartment, hiding in the storage room all this time without me ever knowing. The thought of him watching me as I slept made my skin crawl. I called the police immediately. They arrived quickly and conducted a thorough search of the apartment, particularly the storage room. To my shock, they didn't find anything. No signs that anyone had been there, no hidden space where someone could hide. It was as if the man had vanished without a trace. Despite their reassurances, I knew what I had seen. The camera footage didn't lie. Somehow that man had been sneaking in and out of my apartment, moving around while I slept, and the fact that the police couldn't find any evidence made it even more terrifying. I packed a bag that same night and left the apartment. There was no way I could stay there another minute, not knowing if or when he might return. Even though I moved out, the fear stayed with me. Every night when I close my eyes, I can still picture that man standing in the doorway, silently watching me. And the worst part is, I have no idea where he is now, or if he might still be out there, waiting for another chance to come back. I moved to this suburban neighborhood in Chicago about a month ago. As a software engineer working remotely, I recently left downtown to settle in this quiet residential area. Most of the houses here are standalone, each with its own garage and yard. The pace of life is much slower compared to the city. After living in a cramped apartment for years, having my own house made me feel an incredible sense of freedom. One of the biggest highlights of the property was the spacious garage. Finally, I could park my car inside, safe from the elements and away from any parking tickets. At first, everything seemed perfect, but that sense of peace was shattered one night. It was close to 2 a.m. I had just finished a long day of work and was about to turn off the garage lights before heading to bed. My car was parked inside, and I always used the remote to close the automatic garage door. As I pressed the button to close it, I suddenly heard a faint noise, like something being pushed or a metallic scraping sound. I froze for a moment, a wave of unease washing over me. At first, I thought it was just the wind knocking something over, especially since this area sometimes gets strong gusts. But the sound didn't stop. In fact, it was getting closer. I moved toward the kitchen window, peering out through a small gap in the curtains. Under the dim glow of the streetlight, I saw a shadowy figure standing near the garage door, tugging at it. He was tall and dressed in dark clothes, crouching down as he worked to pry the door open. My heart raced, and sweat began to form on my palms. Gripping my phone tightly, I fumbled to dial 911, my fingers trembling so much that I kept pressing the wrong numbers. Finally, I managed to get through to the dispatcher, who assured me that the police would arrive as quickly as possible. But then I heard a distinct clicking sound, the unmistakable sound of a lock being forced open, and the garage door slowly began to creak open. I held my breath, my body frozen with fear, as I watched the man bend down and slip into the garage. His movements were slow, deliberate, like he knew exactly what he was doing and didn't care if anyone noticed. I felt a chill run down my spine, my mind paralyzed with terror. Then I heard the sound of the car door opening inside the garage. The intruder was now rummaging through my car. My instincts told me to run, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. I forced myself to move, sprinting to the front door to make sure it was locked. Just as I turned to head for my bedroom, I heard a faint metallic clinking from the living room. I stopped dead in my tracks, my eyes wide with panic, staring at the small door that led from the garage into the house. The door lock was jiggling, like someone was trying to open it. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I stood completely still, afraid to make a sound. Then the lock gave a loud click, and the handle slowly began to turn. I felt a lump form in my throat, barely able to breathe. The door inched open, and a shadowy figure silently stepped into the doorway. He was still wearing that dark jacket, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. He just stood there, leaning slightly forward as if to gauge my reaction. His eyes, or at least what I thought were his eyes, were locked on me. The tension in the room was unbearable. By now, it had been several minutes since I'd called the police, but they still hadn't arrived. I had to do something. Fighting the rising panic inside me, I slowly backed away, trying to reach the kitchen for a weapon. As soon as I grabbed a knife, the man suddenly stepped into the living room, his footsteps eerily soft, as if he wasn't worried about being heard. I screamed, brandishing the knife toward him, and yelled, "Get out! The police are on their way!" He didn't rush to leave. Instead, he gave me a cold, eerie smile, as if mocking my fear. His gaze slowly swept across the room before settling back on me. That look, calm, deliberate, sent chills down my spine, as though he had been planning this for a long time. Then, without saying a word, he slowly turned around and walked out of the garage. I heard the door close behind him, followed by his footsteps fading into the night. A few minutes later, flashing blue and red lights lit up my house as the police finally arrived. They immediately inspected the garage and found clear signs of forced entry, scratches on the door and a broken lock. Yet strangely, nothing was missing. My car hadn't been touched, and none of my belongings had been disturbed. The police searched the neighborhood, but there was no trace of the man, as if he had never been there at all. I gave them a detailed description, but I realized I didn't have much to offer. His face was hidden, and the only thing I could remember clearly was that unsettling, icy calmness in his demeanor. The officers left me with their contact information, advising me to change the garage locks and install security cameras, just in case. But even with their reassurances, I couldn't shake the fear that had settled deep inside me. Why had he chosen my garage? Why didn't he steal anything? What was he thinking during those few minutes he spent inside my house? And worst of all, that smile, cold and calculated, haunted me. Over the next few nights, sleep was impossible. I'd lie awake, listening to every creak, every gust of wind, convinced that the man might come back. Every time I glanced toward the garage, I imagined him standing there again, silently watching, waiting for the right moment to make his next move. I'm not sure how much longer I can stand the quiet. Even with new locks and security cameras installed, the fear still lingers. Every night, as darkness falls, I can't shake the feeling that the intruder is just waiting for another chance to step back into my life. And this time, he might not leave so easily. That's today's story. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe to my channel, and turn on the notification bell. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.